my favorite bit, Jim.
I knew you'd say that, Bob. You've been chomping at the bit to talk about blocking.
Well, Blood Bowl's all about the big hits, Jim. The thundering impact, the crunch of bones. Oh, it's music to my ears. Let's hear what Alyssa has to say about it.
You're right, of course. It's practically impossible to win a game of Blood Bowl without giving or getting a few bruises. That's where blocking comes in. When a player attempts a block, they're throwing everything they've got into taking the other player out of commission. Punches, kicks, headbutts. In the violent game of Blood Bowl, almost no holds are barred. Especially if you're willing to bribe the officials. Any player that hasn't moved may attempt to block an adjacent opponent during their activation. Once per team turn, a player can initiate a blitz action to move and throw a block. The block can take place at any time within the blitzing player's movement, and they can even stand up from prone status. To begin the block action, the active coach compares the strength characteristics of both players and rolls a number of block dice, as follows. If the strength values are the same, one block dice is rolled. If one player has a higher strength value, 2 block dice are rolled, and the coach with the strongest player chooses the result. If one player has a strength value more than double their opponent's, all 3 block dice are rolled, and the stronger side chooses the result. The block dice have 5 different facings, each representing a separate outcome. Player down. Something has gone horribly wrong. The player performing the block is knocked down by their opponent. Both down. A rough outcome for both players. On this result, both players are knocked down simultaneously. If either player has the block skill, one of the most useful skills in the whole game, their coach may choose for them to ignore this result and remain standing instead. Push back. A little pushing and shoving never hurt anyone. The active player pushes the target back into one of 3 squares behind the opposing player, after which it can choose to stay put or advance into the newly vacated square. Stumble. The target attempts to avoid the attack. If the player has the ever-useful dodge skill, this result is treated the same as pushback. Otherwise, it's treated as pow! With bone-crushing impact, the target is pushed back and knocked down. The crowd goes wild. Whenever a player is knocked down, or falls down for that matter, it will need an armor roll, which we'll cover in a moment. Of course, Blood Bowl is a team game. When the blocking starts, any nearby teammates will gladly assist their friend to get the upper hand. If a teammate is marking the target of your block and isn't marked by any other opposing players, a +1 bonus is added to your strength score when determining how many dice you roll. The bonus is cumulative, so even smaller players can gang up on big ones. If both sides have adjacent teammates, they'll usually cancel each other out by marking them. Take a moment to check who is really marking who, and it quickly makes sense. If a player is pushed back as a result of a block, the coach of the blocking player chooses where they go, depending on the direction the block comes from. The square a player is pushed back into must be empty if possible. If it's not, then the pushed player might well find themselves subject to a chain push or even pushed into the crowd. Blood Bowl crowds are notoriously savage. No player wants to find themselves stomped flat by 5,000 rowdy orcs. If there are no unoccupied squares behind a player who is pushed back, a chain push may occur. In this situation, the pushed player moves into an occupied square, and the occupant of that square is pushed back too, all chosen by the coach of the original pushing player. Even prone players can be chain pushed, and a chain push can result in a player being shoved into the crowd. Speaking of which, in rare cases, a player may find itself forced into the crowd who won't treat them kindly. A player pushed off the pitch risks injury or even death before being returned to the team's dugout. Speaking of injuries, when a player is knocked down during a block or falls over for any reason, there's a chance they'll end up getting hurt. You'll need to make an armor roll and, depending on how it goes, an injury roll for them, which I'll explain in a moment. If the player survives, place them in their respective dugout. Armor rolls are needed whenever a player is at serious risk, such as being on the losing end of a block attempt. To do this, the coach of the opposing team makes an armor roll on 2d6 and compares the result to the target's armor value. If the roll is lower, the target is safe from harm. For now. If the roll equals or beats the armor value, their armor is broken, and it's time for an injury roll. To make an injury roll, the coach of the opposing team rolls 2d6 and consults the relevant injury table. On a 2 to 7, the player is stunned and laid face down on the pitch, as explained earlier. On an 8 or 9, the player is knocked out and immediately moved to the knocked out box of the team's dugout. If you're lucky, they may recover later on. On a 10 to 12, the unlucky player is injured and moved to the casualty box of the team's dugout. In a league game, the opposing coach then makes a casualty roll against the other player to determine any long-lasting effects. In one-off games, it's customary to roll it anyway, just to see if the poor sap has died. Smaller players with the stunty trait are particularly fragile and roll on an adjusted chart. If the player is injured by the crowd, whatever the outcome, they'll end up back in their dugout. And that's just about everything you need to know about duking it out on the line of scrimmage. Back to the boys in the box.
Well, thanks for covering that in such detail, Alyssa.
Yes, thank you, Alyssa. It brings back so many lovely memories. I promised I wasn't going to do this.
Would you like a tissue?
Please.
Next, we'll move on to another topic near and dear to your heart, Bob. Fouling.
Oh, yeah.